Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 35. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Dr. George Calhoun. Dr. Calhoun is a professor and director at the Hanlon Financial Systems Center at Stevens Institute of Technology. He spent 25 years in the high-tech segment of the wireless communications industry. He was co-founder of InterDigital Communications Corporation, Vice-Chairman of Geotek Communications, and was chairman of the company's engineering joint venture with Rafael Armament Development Authority, a branch of the government of Israel. The chairman and CEO of Illinois Superconductor Corporation as well. George, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in. As I mentioned to you in our pre-show, we'd like to allow our audience a window into a little bit of the background of our guests so they get a sense of why you think the way you do and what brought you to this point in life where we're talking about things China. And so tell us a little bit about where you grew up and where in your education or career journey it bent in the direction of having a conversation about things China.
Well, I guess I would start by saying that I have kind of a hybrid career. I was a long time in the wireless, the high-tech end of the wireless business, as you've mentioned. By the way, the last assignment was a company called Illinois Superconductor, not Semiconductor. It dealt with high-temperature superconducting materials applied in wireless applications. A very, very interesting niche technologically. I guess I'll just say that I was lucky enough to be part of the wireless industry really from the very beginning. The first development of what you now would call 2G and then 3G and 4G and 5G, the digital architectures that allow wireless systems to be what they are today. That was the big transition that InterDigital, my first company, was a part of. Everything that you do today with your smartphone that isn't just talking on the telephone, all the transmission of photographs or videos or applications, all of that rides on a digital layer, and that's what the companies that I was involved with were all focused on. In 2002. 2002, the last company, the Illinois Superconductor that I was the CEO of, it was a turnaround situation. I was put into that position by the major shareholder, which was Elliott Associates, a major private equity firm, hedge fund. And having reached, I guess, the point where the company had been kind of put back on its feet, I was able to ring the bell on the stock exchange, get them relisted, and I thought good time to declare victory and go home because it was a real, it was a stressful assignment. The company was based in Chicago. I lived in New York City. I was commuting out there every week. So I decided to look for a different lifestyle and a new chapter in the career. I joined Stevens Institute of Technology, which is an engineering school, a 150-year-old engineering and science university. They were just in the beginnings of launching a business school. And I don't know if your audience knows where Stevens is. It's in Hoboken, New Jersey, right on the west bank of the Hudson River. So we look at New York City, and those are our constituents, so to speak. The firms that recruit at Stevens and the engagement between the Stevens academic community and the business community is really focused on the financial industry. So I didn't come out of the financial industry, but in my career in the high tech world, you're always raising money, it seems like, and gosh, I guess I was involved in 6 public offerings over the time and many, many other financings. So I was not in the industry, but I was a customer of it, and that led me to um, the position I have today, which is kind of the resident expert in the financial field for the university. And I've built up a number of programs, and I run 2 research centers that are focused on financial science and technology today at Stevens.
So the arc took you out from New York all the way to Chicago, and then sort of brought you right back to the shores. You're just looking across the river, I suppose, and the technology field. There's a whole host of things that we would talk about that touch upon China, and the financial markets touch upon China. But you really crossed our radar when you participated in a policy report that the Heritage Foundation was working on that was talking about transparency and talking about data and truth with regard to the challenges coming from the People's Republic of China. There was a segment of that conversation that was talking about getting at truth about what had happened with COVID inside China. So talk a little bit about how a guy who was dealing with telecommunications and had this fresh start at Stevens and looking at the financial industry and things like that. How did you end up talking and giving some meat on the bones to the conversation on transparency with regard to dealing with the People's Republic, and specifically about what happened with the virus?
Well, I have, in my capacity at Stevens, as the Chinese are certainly a major player in the global economy. They're a major player in the financial markets. So it was always, I would say, from the time I joined the academic world, it was something that I paid a lot of attention to. And over the years, one of the focuses that I had developed was really to try to understand the data, because the data, and I was initially looking at economic data, GDP, or any of the other unemployment, or any of the standard kinds of metrics that we take for granted here in the United States. In the second largest economy, those metrics are not very transparent, and there are a lot of questions related to the integrity of the data, or whether the information is really reliable or is being manipulated in some way. So I was kind of tuned into that topic, and when COVID hit all of us, it was a new fountain of data that turned on, and you paid attention to it because it was clear that it was going to have a major economic impact. That's the reason I would have been watching it. I'm not a medical scientist. But the manipulation that began pretty much after the first couple of months, the manipulation of the data. So I'm going to steer clear of questions of how COVID arose, or whether it's a lab leak, or whether those are things I'm not probably qualified to comment on. I have opinions, but what I did start to look at and track very closely was the reporting of the data that was coming out of China on mortality, on infection rates. These are things that would have an impact on the economy. And as China went into a lockdown, a series of very intensive lockdowns, you're trying to figure out what's going on. You're trying to understand this is a major economy, and it is just it's so opaque on something that was affecting our economy. We know what it did to our economy. It really was a shock that rippled through all the statistics that we track, all the data that we track, and you weren't seeing that you didn't get a good sense of what was going on in China. So that's why I started to look at it more closely.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because data in China is one of those mega topics that is ever present in looking at modern China. It's the underpinning of any debate about what kind of policy we've had in the past and what its objectives were supposed to accomplish. And early in my career, it was working in the government and trying to read economic trends, and we had access to some things that were not what would be out in regular business news reporting, but at the same time, it was sort of still in that dark room, feeling an elephant from different positions and not really feeling like you're getting the whole picture. And so a lot of us came up through China studies and policy work with deep skepticism about the quantity and quality of the data that we would have. But if you could, maybe if I put it more simply, tell us a little bit about what were the sources of data that you could get at when you're dealing with a topic like this. This is obviously a sensitive topic to the government of China at the time, but there was access, especially in that initial period, to much more data. But talk a little bit initially about where could you go to have reliable sources, and then after time passed and it elevated as kind of a international issue. How did the access to those sources change?
Well, the story is interesting. The outbreak occurred towards the end of 2019 and into early 2020. And again, there's debates about when and where the very first cases occurred. But I think in the beginning, the Chinese authorities in Wuhan were reacting to a crisis that they didn't necessarily understand. They hadn't figured out yet what was going on. So the data, there's a lot of confusion in that type of situation that I think is forgivable. And it would have been, and it was the same here in the U.S. when we started to try to understand what the scope of the pandemic was here. But for the first 90 days, I would say the first quarter of 2020, the reporting was pretty good, and it was in line with from Wuhan. You look at the mortality statistics, you look at the case rate, the fatality case rate. In other words, how many people catch the disease and how many are infected with the disease, and then what's the mortality rate for those folks that are infected. Those numbers in the first 90 days or until April of 2020 they look pretty much in line with other experience in other parts of the world. But then in April, they stop. And the reporting from that point basically for the next 2 years until December of 2022, when they finally released themselves, they released the country, Beijing released the country from the zero COVID lockdowns. They reported essentially 0 deaths, 0 infections. There was a small outbreak in Shanghai that they reported just a small handful of people affected. And this is a city of 20 million plus people that was shut down in almost a prison level, penitentiary level lockdown. So from that point in April 2020 until today, all of the statistics just don't make sense that are being released. And even after zero COVID was lifted, there was a small adjustment to the for fatalities, the data on mortality. But then it was shut down again. And basically, they've stopped reporting, they've stopped testing, they've stopped releasing the information related to anything specific to COVID. And so it's pretty much a complete blackout since April of 2020. That meant that if you wanted to try and understand what was the impact, what was going on, you had to look to other metrics that weren't being suppressed. And that's the way I approached it. And it's the way that a number of other people, other groups around the world also tried to get at it in much the same way.
So at that time, what you're going for, correct me if I'm wrong, you're trying to look at what is this really doing to GDP or the real economy. It wasn't necessarily trying to get at how many, ground truth of how many cases and the medical situation generally or what have you, but we've got an outbreak, we've got a shutdown. This has to be having an impact on the major manufacturing platform of the planet, on which many parts of the world are supremely dependent. So, am I right? You're basically looking at what can I get at by way of real usable data on what's happening with economic growth, contraction, disruption, things like that. Am I right?
Well, all of those, yes, you are, and all of those metrics are also highly questionable. There are a number of groups that study the economic data in particular and cast a lot of doubt on pretty much any of the recent economic claims for GDP growth and so forth. What I looked at, which I thought was the most compelling sort of window into all of this, was something that was very basic: the overall death rate in China, in the country, as reported to the UN and the WHO and the World Bank and a number of other international institutions collect this information, and it's reported by the Chinese Bureau of Statistics. And the death rate in China, and so we're talking about the total death rate for the whole population from all causes, shows a very revealing pattern that in 2019, it jumped by about a factor of 5. So you had clearly, and it stayed up. So you clearly had an event of some kind taking place that was now causing much higher death rate of mortality across the country. And its timing fits with the COVID outbreak. So I think it's at least a plausible hypothesis that that's what was causing the excess, they call it excess mortality. And working from those numbers, and other groups have done similar work, you come to something like 3 million excess deaths, or maybe twice that number. It probably will take a while for people to get a more accurate picture, but it's certainly, this is as compared to the official figure, which is about 100,000 deaths that they've suffered over the entire trajectory of the pandemic. But more than the mortality, I think what lies, you then look at the potential impact on the economy and start with just the effect on the healthcare system. And every measure, if you look at comparative measures of what happened in Hong Kong, what happened in Taiwan, what happened in Korea, all of those are countries that followed very strict zero COVID policies, similar to China. And of course, Hong Kong is just about as similar a comparable as you could find. And if you apply the numbers that you see in Hong Kong or some of those other countries, New Zealand is another one, Singapore is another one that were very similar comparables, you start to see the impact beyond just the mortality. It's the overwhelming of the healthcare system, and probably focused on the rural areas where the healthcare system is much less developed than it is in the major cities. And the other peculiar thing about the Chinese policies in response to COVID is that they did not use the 2 years of severe lockdown to vaccinate the most vulnerable populations aggressively. It's strange. I mean, as an authoritarian regime, they could tell they could weld people into their apartment buildings. They could, keep people from traveling, but they didn't apply that same sort of directed policy making to a vaccination program. And so even when the zero COVID was lifted, there were still tens and tens of millions of elderly Chinese over the age of 60, over the age of 80, that were unvaccinated and or partially vaccinated. And of course, the scientific studies that have been done tend to say that the vaccines that were used in China, which were domestically developed there on the basis of different types of scientific technologies than the ones that were successful here, were less. Those Chinese vaccines were less effective. So they had a large population, certainly over 100 million people, that you would have characterized as essentially unprotected, immunologically unprepared, was how Nature magazine put it in one of their assessments.
So we look at this period, you see the mortality figures, it kind of helps shed light on where the truth might be on the onset of a catalytic event. It can't tease apart whether people are dying because of or with COVID or whatever, but you can just look in aggregate. There's a bump up. It's an outlier, and it goes up and it stays up for a while, which also kind of rebuts the government's communication about there being this effective zero COVID policy, because whatever this magical ingredient was that led to the bump up in an aggregate death rate, it stayed up through that period, which also sort of begs the question, how long would you have had to have a lockdown and see these death figures where they were? And a rational scientist would say, we're controlling the wrong variable in this equation, because something's still spreading and you're still having a COVID or COVID-like situation, whether you want to call it that or not. But seemingly the world early in that 2020 experience looked at China and drew some of the sort of policy and control options from what was being done in China and applied them here and in other places. Everything from masking to the social distancing or what have you had some degree of being informed, but I'm less diving into the debate about how we responded. There's a rich conversation to be had there, but it's more, why do you think this played out the way it did in China? I mean, it's unusual that they would not be tracking kind of where these aggregate death numbers are, and the isolation alone wasn't pulling that back down for a long period of time. And then why wouldn't they have been vaccinating the vulnerable population? Is it just the callousness of this is a non-productive part of society, and if survival of the fittest needs to play out, so be it? Or is there some other rationale that we can try to put our heads around? I mean, I assume we're just speculating based on what we can see, but tell me, you looked at this data and you were looking at these things. Surely you must have been confused by some of it too.
Well, there is the extremely dark hypothesis that this was a nice way to take care of some of their demographic imbalance. I can't believe that. I can't bring myself to believe that that's what was going on. I think instead it was more likely a response that is very common in Chinese policy coming from the top to if you've got a problem, you want to cover it up. You want to keep it under wraps and present a face of success and competence. That's what the Chinese Communist Party, I think that's their reputational asset, is that they run things well. They're good at running these things. They're competent. They can manage crises, and they made a big play for this argument, I think, in the early stages of the COVID breakout, because you looked at what was happening in the United States and most other countries around the world. it was a very chaotic process in the early stages, and people before we had a vaccine, we didn't really know how to respond to it properly, didn't know what path it was going to take. And so the chaotic crisis mode that the West was in and the U.S. was in, I think the Chinese were looking at that, and the Chinese Communist Party wanted to say, well, we're in charge. We've got a better program, and if the data bubbling up from underneath was going to contradict that, well, the solution is stop reporting the data.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
what they did. They just basically shut down the data reporting from April 15th of 2020 until December of 2022. And then they opened the door a crack, and then they closed it again. And now there is no more COVID data coming from China today, essentially.
Yeah.
So, I think that's what was going on. If I have to interpret from a distance, I think it was the desire to appear in control, to appear as though their methods were working to contain this problem. And at a certain point, they realized that it wasn't working, and they released everything, and then they just shut down the reporting, and they've declared victory and gone home. They're from the.
Well, so let's pivot a little bit from the sort of COVID specific part of the conversation to reading the economic data. This obviously was a significant economic event inside China. And I don't know that there's really been very deep assessments done in business reporting or otherwise to really get a good handle on what was the magnitude of this economic event. And economic events have to have social and political and security consequences that are important for our decision makers to have in mind. It has to affect some of the manufacturing beachheads that are where the global supply chains had been served. But basically, in what you had been trying to dive into through that period and looking back on that now, how best could you educate us on what you assess the magnitude, nature, key takeaways are from this, I would argue, significant economic event about which we don't really get that much conversation?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. If you go back a year or a little more than a year ago, when the end of zero COVID was announced, the storyline that the Chinese brought out, and that a lot of observers in the West also assumed would be the case, would be a strong economic rebound in China. And I'm talking about reports that you would have gotten from analysts at places like Goldman Sachs and others that were very bullish at the beginning of 2023 that this was going to be the sign or the conditions to allow for a real economic recovery, a fast recovery, and they were worrying about the implications of that for rising inflation and other things. That hasn't happened, and the analyses that you read today of the kind of a shocking downturn in the Chinese economy. And now the story is, the question is, are they entering into a Japanification scenario where they can be looking at long-term deflation, long-term stagnation, similar to what happened in Japan following the bursting of their bubble back at the end of the 1980s. What's interesting to me is that even today, as you read the scenarios assessing this, I think there's an underappreciation of the significance of the COVID outbreak that truly did take place in China, and it accelerated into this unvaccinated population like a wildfire at the beginning of 2020. I think they had I think that's a major contributor to their economic downturn. And there's a lot of psychology here as well. The Chinese population had been locked up for 2 years, locked up
Yeah.
basically for 2 years, and then you declare, okay, the lockup is over. You can go out, but they realize that in fact now it's even entered a phase that may be a little bit worse than they had before, because now people are dying, people are getting sick, the hospitals are being overwhelmed, particularly in the rural areas. All the social stress of the epidemic that we went through here over maybe a 2-year period was compressed for them as they came out of the zero COVID lockdown. So I think it's a major contributor to the economic downturn there, and to the psychological malaise. I don't know, you should have a stronger word probably for it, that seems to have infected now the population in China, and maybe has given the government a sense also that they aren't sure what to do. There's a lot of doubt, I think, that you can detect in the Chinese situation, purges of high-level officials, changes in or uncertainty about how to respond to economic developments like the property crisis and others. They're not showing the sort of decisiveness that they would like to, has been associated with their form of government for the past 20 years or more.
Well, if you look at kind of the lessons you've taken away from taking a deep dive into this and watching it over time, whether it's from the tech and business kind of background or thinking from a financial markets and investment point of view, what do you think are kind of the mega lessons people should take away from this? Here you've got a major force in the global supply chain, a major force in the global economy that has gone through a period of profound, I'd say, non-transparency, and has had I guess the equivalent of an earthquake that we know we can read sort of the seismic signals from a distance, but we don't have a good handle on the extent of damage, recovery, what have you in this. What are sort of the adjustments should be made? Is this a time when leaders should be thinking through forms of decoupling, de-risking, pick your word? Is it a time where, as Goldman Sachs, you'd mentioned in early 2023, very, very bullish. Now there's talk from similar quarters saying, China's a really big risk to be investing in now.
Uninvestable. Uninvestable is the word they're using.
Really, as someone who's watched this stuff for 35 years, it's shocking to see that magnitude of a change coming from what was among the greatest cheerleader quarters of the China miracle, so to speak. So what do you think the key takeaways should be for leaders in finance, manufacturing, tech? And how do you think we're doing in the United States about understanding and adjusting to this?
Well, the change in the weather has been very abrupt and amazing reversal of sentiment, public sentiment. You probably are aware, if you look at general opinion polls among the public, even 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, it was generally a majority of positive opinion held by the U.S. public on relations with China, and that has flipped now to very strongly negative. And I think if you dig into those numbers, it's driven by the COVID, the mishandling of the COVID situation, or the public's perception of how that has been mishandled or manipulated by the Chinese government. And I see, as the headlines sort of accumulate, I think the decoupling is underway big time. I think a lot of companies are not yet talking loudly about it, because until they've completely achieved whatever the decoupling is that they want to achieve, they don't want to annoy their counterparts in China and speed up the negative consequences that they're going to have to endure. But you look at what even companies like Apple, that a few years ago they were basically saying China is our solution to how we manufacture, is designed in California, manufactured in China, assembled in China. That was a brand label that that was a very positive kind of statement for them. Well, now they're looking, I think even Apple is looking at how they can de-risk away from that dependence on China. And many other companies are doing the same thing. And in the finance space, I just read yesterday, Vanguard, the second largest, I think they're the second largest asset manager in the world after BlackRock. They're pulling out of China. If you're an asset manager, you're managing people's savings and pensions and so forth. That the Chinese market has been the next big thing for asset management and finance for 20 years. The prospect of 1.5 billion people that were rising into the middle class and we're going to have savings and pensions, and they have, of course, a higher savings rate even than we do here. That was the target for so many firms in the financial world, and they're all pulling back. To one degree or another, they're pulling back. And one of the side stories here is the demise, I'll call it, because I think that's what it is, the demise of Hong Kong as a financial center. I think they're done. There's still a lot of people. Again, decoupling and reorienting a major industry like finance, in this case we're speaking about, is not something that happens in a month or a year. But over this, let's say, the decade that we're probably about 20% of the way into, I think in a decade's time, you're going to look back and Hong Kong will not be a player anymore, and a lot of the commitments to China, that anything that involves data, which is China is really cracking down on anything that lives on knowing having information about what's happening in China. And of course, the financial industry, they're all about that. If you're going to be in the finance world, you have to have that good, transparent information. Or technology, and the semiconductor field is another one that I have some background in as well. And I think, I'll pause there if you.
Well, so we can kind of get a sense of where the dark cloud is. Let's try to talk a little bit about maybe where some opportunity has been created as a result of what we've seen happen. If the trends continue as they appear now, there's this catalytic event. It's not been a good one. It's been disruptive inside China, and no one really is getting perfect data. We're nowhere in economic theory world of perfect information, of trying to be able to assess these things inside the People's Republic. The travesty that is Hong Kong, I would like, just from a human level, for it to be able to go back to what it once was. Right. It was a glorious place to visit for a very long time, played a magnificent role in the world for a long time, but it has suffered greatly at its own hands in some ways. I have to say, there's a lot of people that I know that were friends years back and not that long ago who've been in prison for extended periods of time. So having it be a location of political prisoners, highly controlled data, things like a national security law that make firms kind of at risk of arrest, detention, not literally not being able to leave. It's just such a dramatic and rapid change. But with all of this, and I would agree with the idea that the decoupling has been underway. I mean, in some ways, China's been starting the decoupling process itself, and others are catching up in a way. Where do you see some opportunities, perhaps, whether it's in semiconductors, communications, or other tech generally, with the finance houses having to leave former financial hubs? When people thought that Shanghai was going to be a beachhead for them, that it would be the new Hong Kong. And so Shanghai is a different world today than it was a few years ago. Hong Kong is a different world from where it was. Where does this go? Does it advantage Singapore? Are there things that Taiwan can and should be doing to get some advantage that could be good for the United States, the free world, etc.? Japan, Korea, do you see adjustments there elsewhere? So we've talked a little bit about the glass half empty part of this. I think what's some of the glass half full part? If there's an adjustment, there's still a demand. There's still really great advances in technology happening, and there's still a lot of money ready to be invested for manufacturing and deploying leading edge technology in the free world. Where do you see the opportunity?
Well, I think you're seeing it already in Japan, for example, which is their stock market indexes hit an all-time high just recently. They seem like they are finally now sort of getting their mojo back in various ways. They have a major development underway to become, again, a strong player in the semiconductor business, attracting investment from Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing in southern Japan, but not just them, to really build back their industry and become a stronger force in the global economy. They've been kind of in their own funk for a while, but they seem to be coming out of it. I'm a big fan of Korea. I did a lot of business in Japan and in Korea in my corporate days, and I always would tell people that it's very difficult for an American firm to do business in Japan. Maybe that'll be a little easier now, but it was super easy to do business in Korea, and I think the strength of that relationship is one that will also benefit. Not that there aren't costs of adjustment. Both of those countries had and still have significant entanglements with the Chinese markets. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying those are going to go away overnight, but as they reorient to a supply ecosystem, I'm thinking again, perhaps a little bit of the semiconductor ecosystem that I know more about. As that ecosystem reorients away from China, it's going to benefit those two economies for sure. Taiwan, I don't know. I'm not a geopolitician. I don't know how to handicap the risk of something, outside the box of the economic system, or a military action. I don't know what to say about that. If it does not happen, it will tend to, of course, Taiwan is a very strong player in many sectors of the ecosystem today, the semiconductor ecosystem, and financially, I guess Singapore has been benefiting from a lot of the outfall from the Hong Kong demise that's going on. So yeah, I think there are. I mean, it's not that. I think Asia will still be a very, very important part of the economy and a growing part of the economy. But I think China's leadership there has taken a big hit, and people will be looking to these other countries from an economic standpoint. The market in China is still 1 billion people, and I think that's going to have a gravitational force. But will they be in a position to be more than just a market? I don't know. They don't. I will just say this. I know we're coming to the end of the period, but I would say that in the semiconductor space, which I know something about, I think there's a tendency in the West to greatly overestimate Chinese technical capabilities, greatly overestimate. And I think that gap is only going to grow now that there's an orientation towards getting decoupled thoroughly or de-risked at least, de-risking at least, and decoupling potentially.
Yeah. Well, I guess the moral of the story could be, it turns out if you want to be at the cutting edge of technology and finance, as you were describing, I mean, data that is reliable, verifiable, and in great supply is kind of the oxygen that lets those two areas really thrive. And you have to have protections of intellectual property, and you have to basically have personal security and to be able to thrive in those kinds of industries. And it's just shocking to me to having watched what could have been the easiest job in the world, to just sit back and say thank you to the world for showering my country with unearned access and huge amounts of capital and tremendous concentration of manufacturing in my own country. If I had been a leader in China, I could just sat back and popped popcorn and just let my pockets fill. And yet, for some reason, they felt that they needed to go this other way and unleash their wolf warriors and have whatever else is happening and step on the miracle that was Hong Kong. And I just, it's one of those things where you can't really impose our rationality. We just have to sit back and do somewhat of what I perceive the lessons from your experiences of just read the book as it is, read the data as we can get at it, and draw honest lessons from what it's presenting. But I just want to thank you for the work that you've done. I think you bring a fresh angle of vision onto some of these topics that comes across a little bit differently than if you'd just been kind of a resident China expert at a particular university, think tank, or other institution. And I just think that fresh approach, digging deep into the data, makes a real contribution, and it certainly made a contribution to our conversation today. But before we wrap, is there any place that you'd like to point people to follow your work, your commentary, any of the reports or books that are out there, anything you would just like to leave with the audience?
Well, I do write a column for Forbes online. I'm a contributor, and I try to do about one a week. I did one yesterday. I've been working more in topics of monetary policy lately, U.S. oriented, but Chinese topics, semiconductors, markets, both in the U.S. and China, and a little bit in Europe. So anyhow, it's a Forbes. I guess you could Google my name and Forbes, and you'll get there.
Excellent. Well, to our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform. Thank you very much for joining, and a special thank you to George Calhoun for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.